Buckle in, folks, because it's Friday, and we're talking about vampires. Specifically, the Mercy Brown vampire incident. The tale of the Mercy Brown vampire incident was used as inspiration for many famous vampire tales, including one of the most well-known vampire stories of all time. You guessed it, Dracula. This was not Stoker's only source of inspiration. There were also newspaper clippings from the event, along with other historical figures such as Vlad the Impaler, and other vampire stories such as Carmilla were found among Stoker's research notes. So, let's set the stage. The year was 1892. The location was a small rural town with a sparse population known as Exeter, Rhode Island. Our vampire, Mercy Lena Brown. Mercy Brown was only 19 years old when she fell ill with tuberculosis, a disease that had devastated many families in the region at that time. Her mother and her sister had already died from the disease in 1883, and her brother was also suffering from it. Within the next few years, death came for Mercy herself. Mercy succumbed to her illness, and she died in January 1892. The community became increasingly suspicious because of the spread of tuberculosis in the family, which led to the belief that one of the deceased family members could be a vampire or a night-walking spirit causing the disease to spread among the living members of the family. This belief was not uncommon in 19th century New England, where tuberculosis often led to the death of people in waves, and people sometimes turned to superstitions and folk beliefs to explain the spread of the illness and the vast amounts of death that they were experiencing. There was a widespread belief that a dead person might feed on the living, especially if that person had died from consumption. So, the remaining members of the Mercy Brown family included George, her father, and her teenage brother Edwin, who worked as a store clerk. In what seemed the blink of an eye, Edwin became suddenly frail and sick. The village doctor informed George, Mercy's father, that Edwin had consumption, and it was consumption that had been taking his family. But the superstitious townfolk of Exeter had another explanation: vampires. Thus, a group of men entered Exeter's Chestnut Hill Cemetery on a frigid March afternoon in 1892. There, they began to exhume the bodies of Mercy's mother and her sister. They had concluded that one of the deceased was leaving the grave at night to suck the life out of the remaining living relatives. Both Mary and her daughter Mary Olive were decomposing at a natural rate. But when they opened the coffin of Mercy, they gazed upon her with aberration. Mercy's body was reportedly found unusually well preserved, which fueled suspicions that she might have been a vampire. Some accounts suggest that her body was still somewhat intact despite being buried for over 2 months. Additionally, her heart and liver were said to be unnaturally bloated or full of fluid. The local doctor and others involved in the exhumation concluded that her body was likely feeding on her brother, which they interpreted as evidence of vampirism. They determined that Mercy Lena Brown was indeed a vampire, and only by killing the vampire could young Edwin be saved. So, Mercy's heart was pulled from her chest, and it was burned to ash on a nearby rock. The ashes were mixed into a tonic for Edwin to consume in hopes of curing him. Unfortunately, he was not cured, and he succumbed to his illness only 2 months later. To the less superstitious, there was perhaps nothing so unusual about the well-preserved condition of Mercy Brown's body. Mercy died in January. The ground was quite hard from the freezing temperatures, and so, in lieu of putting her into the ground, she was placed in an above-ground crypt in the cold of Rhode Island, and, on the first thaw, they interred her into the still cold earth. Her body had frozen in the above-ground crypt, and they placed the coffin into the cold earth, so naturally, it wasn't quite decomposing at the rate that it should have. The mysterious wave of illness that swept George Brown's family was most likely tuberculosis, a condition that had no cure until 1943, when streptomycin was developed by Salman Waxman, Elizabeth Bougie, and Albert Schatz. But that did not keep Rhode Island from becoming known as the vampire capital of America. The Mercy Brown incident is one of the most famous examples of the New England vampire panic that occurred in the 18th and 19th centuries. It highlights how people used folklore and rituals to cope with widespread disease and a lot of unfortunate death. The case also gained attention in the context of the rising vampire myths, contributing to the popularization of the vampire and vampire legends in American culture. All right, that's all I have for you today. I will see you next Friday for Fanged Fridays.